the cold metal of my house keys pressed into my palm as I spotted my son and his wife crouched by my front door. Still, I stayed in the shadows, watching my own flesh and blood try to force their way into my home. As the keys warmed in my grip, so did the truth I'd been ignoring for years. While they whispered like strangers, I saw no hesitation, just entitlement. The same keys I once gave him in case of emergency now felt like a weapon turned back on me. That's when I stepped forward and said, "Funny, looks like I canceled more than just a flight." All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Clara sat quietly in the back seat of the taxi, her fingers nervously tapping on the worn leather seat. She had just been informed that her flight had been canceled due to a mechanical issue, and all she could think about was the quiet evening ahead. The airport terminal had been a blur of noise and exhaustion, but now, on the road back to her suburban home, there was only a quiet hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of the streetlights outside. She glanced at the familiar city streets that blurred past her window, tree-lined, cozy, and unremarkable in their consistency. Her mind wandered to her son, David, and his wife, Emma. The same old thoughts crept into her consciousness, how things had been strained between them lately. When David had invited her to stay with him and Emma, she'd been hopeful, but lately, the space between them had felt larger than ever. David had been distant, torn between the demands of his wife and his mother, and Emma. Emma had a way of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Clara had tried to ignore the subtle, passive-aggressive comments Emma made, the constant air of control that seeped from her. But it was the silence between them that hurt the most. It seemed like no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bridge the gap between them. She had hoped for a calm return to her house, but even as she thought it, she knew deep down that there was something about tonight that felt different. Maybe it was the cancellation, or the uneasy calm that had settled over her in the last few weeks. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the taxi turned the corner onto her street, Clara's stomach tightened. There, up ahead, was the site of her little home. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it had been hers for so many years. Her heart sank at the thought of how little it had felt like home lately. The cab came to a slow stop in front of her house, but something made Clara hesitate. The street was empty, as it always was at this hour, but as she began to gather her things, a strange sound caught her attention. It was faint at first, a scraping noise, followed by a muffled thud. Clara's head snapped toward the front door of her house. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed it before, but now she could hear it more clearly, a frantic, desperate noise, the unmistakable sound of metal against wood. Someone was at the door. Her pulse quickened. David? Emma? What on earth were they doing? She frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. She stepped out of the cab, the cold air biting at her skin, and walked slowly toward the house, her eyes scanning the front porch. The noise grew louder, sharper, like the sound of someone forcing the door open, the door that had always been a symbol of security to her. Her breath hitched in her throat. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Clara paused, standing frozen for a moment in the middle of the yard, trying to steady her racing heartbeat. She wasn't sure if she should shout or just barge in and confront them. She chose the latter, but slowly, carefully, she approached the door. The sound was unmistakable now. Scraping, shuffling, and a quiet mutter of voices she couldn't quite make out. She didn't need to hear the words to know that something was off. She placed her hand on the doorknob, but before she turned it, she stopped. There was an odd feeling. A weight in the air, like a strange pressure in her chest. It wasn't just the noise, it was everything. The way the house felt so still, yet so full of tension. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open, half expecting to find an explanation, maybe even an apology from David and Emma. But when the door creaked open, her stomach twisted. David and Emma were there, both of them, standing awkwardly near the doorframe. But the scene before her was far from normal. Emma's face was flushed, her eyes wide with a kind of urgency, her hands gripping the edge of the door as though she were trying to yank it off its hinges. David stood just a few feet away, his face pale, his expression conflicted, like he didn't know what to do. Clara froze. For a moment, no one spoke. "What are you two doing?" Clara finally asked, her voice small but laced with disbelief. Neither of them responded right away. Emma shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the ground, while David looked at her with a mixture of guilt and confusion. It took a beat, but then David cleared his throat. "Mom, it's not what it looks like." Clara's heart thudded in her chest. "Then what is it, David?" she asked, her voice cracking. She couldn't suppress the rising sense of dread in her gut. Something was happening here, something she didn't fully understand, but she could feel it. Something was wrong. Emma opened her mouth, but it was David who spoke first. "You don't have to worry about it," he said quickly, his voice too quick to be reassuring. "We're just—" Clara took a step forward, her mind racing, and before she could say anything, she realized she was no longer welcome here. Her throat went dry as the realization hit her like a cold wave, the tension, the distance, the quiet discomfort. It wasn't just her imagination. Something had shifted, something unspoken between them, and it was more than just a disagreement or a passing moment of tension. Her heart raced as she watched them standing in her home that no longer felt like hers at all. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were things happening behind closed doors, things her son and daughter-in-law were hiding from her. And no matter how much she wanted to ignore it, Clara knew deep down that the life she thought she had wasn't the one she'd been living. "Mom." David's voice broke through her thoughts, but Clara was already too far gone, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had they been hiding? And why hadn't she seen it sooner? The door to her old life slammed shut. Clara stepped into the doorway, her body still trembling from the shock of what she'd just seen. Her fingers were tight around the doorknob, as if she could somehow hold on to her old life by sheer will alone. The house, the place she had built a life in with her late husband, no longer felt familiar. It felt foreign, as if she had stepped into someone else's world. David and Emma stood there in silence, their bodies stiff and angled away from her, as though they were trying to retreat from something that couldn't be escaped. The space between them and Clara was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. David's eyes were the first to meet hers, and there was something in them, something raw and vulnerable, that made Clara's stomach twist in an unfamiliar way. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was more a kind of regret. Emma, on the other hand, was doing her best to avoid Clara's gaze, her posture tight, the flush of her cheeks betraying the sense of panic Clara hadn't noticed before. She glanced at David, then quickly at the door, then back to Clara. Her lips parted, but no words came. For a moment, the room felt suffocating. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, every beat of it echoing the dissonance of the situation. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. What are you two doing?" Clara finally asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She knew the words sounded calm, but the tremor behind them couldn't be concealed. David shifted his weight uncomfortably, his face drawn, eyes darting toward Emma for a moment before he looked back at her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Clara's eyes narrowed, her mind piecing together the fragments. Something was off. She felt it in the silence, in the way they couldn't meet her gaze. "David," she said, her voice hardening, Why were you trying to force open the door? David swallowed. His jaw tightened as he avoided her eyes, staring instead at the floor. It's nothing, Mom. Really. Clara's stomach twisted. Nothing wasn't an explanation. She stepped forward, her shoes clicking on the hardwood floor, the sound sharp in the heavy quiet. Emma shifted again, her discomfort more apparent now. She opened her mouth, but Clara didn't wait for her to speak. Emma? Clara's voice was soft but piercing. What's going on? Emma hesitated, glancing at David once more before her gaze fell to her feet. She began, then trailed off, swallowing hard. It's just... the door stuck. We were just trying to fix it. Clara's brow furrowed. That explanation made no sense. The door had never stuck before, and even if it had, why hadn't they just called her? Why had they gone to such lengths to force it open when all they needed to do was ask? Clara's pulse began to quicken as she looked from David to Emma, piecing the fractured reality together. Something was happening, something they weren't telling her. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel just confused. She felt a sharp, gut-deep sense of betrayal. It's not about the door, Clara thought, as the realization slowly began to sink in. It never had been. She had spent years, since her husband's death, trying to hold on, trying to keep her son close. She had thought if she could just help, just stay involved, that maybe they could find their way back to something like a family again. But now, standing in the doorway, Clara felt like a stranger in her own home. She felt like an outsider to her own life. David's eyes finally met hers, but his expression was blank, distant. He hadn't spoken since the initial exchange. And Emma. Emma's eyes were fixed on the floor, her lips pursed, as if she were trying to control something inside her. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it now. The distance, the walls they had built between themselves and her. She could feel the weight of the things they had been hiding from her. You two have been keeping things from me, haven't you? Clara said. The words tumbling out of her like stones dropping into a well. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was no anger in her words, just a quiet understanding. She knew. She knew there was more to this than a stuck door. David's face contorted in something between frustration and shame, but he didn't say a word. Emma, on the other hand, opened her mouth as if to argue, but Clara wasn't interested in hearing more lies, more evasions. She had lived with silence for too long, and it had eaten away at her enough to know when to stop pretending. I've been holding on to this, trying to stay close to you, David, Clara continued, her voice firm now. But I've been stuck. I've been caught between you and Emma for too long. She shook her head slowly, her heart sinking. And I think I've been trying to control things that aren't mine to control anymore. Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. David stepped back, a visible tension in his posture, as if he couldn't bear the weight of her words. Emma's eyes flicked up to Clara for a brief moment, then quickly dropped again. Clara's chest tightened, the reality of the situation finally dawning on her. Clara had tried to hold on to what she thought was a family, but what she was really holding on to was a dream. A dream of the family that no longer existed. David, Clara whispered, her voice raw. I see it now. The things you've been hiding. The things she's been hiding. You're not the son I thought I knew anymore. David flinched at her words, but it was too late. The distance was there, between them and inside her. And there was no going back. The door to their shared life had been forced open, and all the secrets they had been keeping spilled out into the light, leaving Clara standing in the ruins of a family that had never been whole. The days that followed the confrontation felt like a fog, the air thick with things left unsaid. Clara hadn't heard from David or Emma since the night they'd stood in the doorway. the unspoken weight of their silence pressing down on her every waking moment. Each phone call went unanswered. Each message left floating in the empty space between them. She spent the hours alone, her thoughts circling in the quiet corners of the house. There was a strange peace to the stillness, a kind of numbing calm that came with knowing, finally, that she couldn't pretend anymore. The house that had once been her refuge now felt like a cage, each creak of the floorboards reminding her of the past she couldn't change. But as the days dragged on, something inside her began to stir. The unease grew into something sharper, an urgency, a longing to stop waiting and take control of the life she still had left. Clara knew that she could no longer stay silent. She could no longer pretend that everything would just magically resolve itself. The weight of years of silence was too much to bear. Clara had always been the one to hold things together, the one who tried to smooth the cracks, to make everything right. But it wasn't right anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. And today, she would change that. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The house was quiet, as it had been for days now. She could hear the soft tick of the clock on the wall, its steady rhythm reminding her that time was passing, and she could feel it slipping away. Her heart was uneasy, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. Determination. She had to do this. She had to face her son and his wife. It had been a long time coming, and Clara knew it wouldn't be easy. But if she didn't speak now, she might never get the chance. She stood up, her legs unsteady, but her resolve firm. Her phone was still in her hand, her finger hovering over David's number. She had called him countless times before, each time hoping he would pick up, that maybe, just maybe, he would hear her. But now, she wasn't waiting anymore. With a deep breath, Clara dialed his number. The line rang once, twice, and then his voice, tentative, almost tired, crackled through the speaker. "Mom?" Clara's throat tightened, but she cleared it, steadying herself. "David," she said, her voice a mixture of weariness and resolve. "I need you to come over. There are things we need to talk about. I can't keep waiting." There was a long pause on the other end. Clara could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the rustle of papers, and the soft hum of his house in the background. Then David spoke, his voice low and uncertain. I don't know, Mom. Can't we just—" "No." The word slipped out before she could stop it. "I've waited long enough. This has to stop. You can't keep trying to balance me and Emma forever, David. It's not working." Clara felt the sharpness of her words hang in the air between them. It was true. She had been trying for so long to hold on to a family that no longer existed. But now, it was clear that she couldn't be part of the life they had built if she didn't stop pretending it was all fine. If she didn't speak the truth. Another pause. This time, longer. Clara could hear the faint sound of David's breath on the other end. He was waiting, perhaps thinking of what to say, maybe trying to find the right words. She wasn't sure. But she knew that silence, that hesitation, it was part of the problem. It had been for too long. "I'll be over in 20, David finally said, his voice low. Clara hung up the phone without saying goodbye. She didn't need to. There was nothing more to say. She took a moment to collect herself, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the mug and placed it in the sink. Her chest felt tight, the weight of the moment settling on her like a stone. She wasn't sure what would happen when David arrived, but she knew one thing. Whatever came next, she would no longer be afraid to face it. She moved to the living room and sat on the couch, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. The silence in the house was deafening now, the kind of silence that only happens when something is about to break. Clara felt the tension in her body, the anticipation of what was to come. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, pulling Clara from her thoughts. She stood up slowly, her knees slightly unsteady. When she opened the door, David was standing there, looking unsure, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Behind him, the evening sky was darkening, the last light of the day slipping away. "Mom?" David said, his voice quiet. Clara nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. "Come in, David. We need to talk." David walked in, his footsteps slow, hesitant. Emma wasn't with him. Clara hadn't expected her to be. Emma had never been one for confrontation, but Clara didn't need her there. This was between her and David now. David stood just inside the doorway, his shoulders slumped. The distance between them felt like a chasm, wide and unbridgeable. But Clara wasn't going to avoid it anymore. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the couch. "We need to figure out where we go from here." David didn't move at first, but then, slowly, he sat. The tension between them was thick, the unspoken words weighing heavy on both of them. Clara exhaled, her gaze steady. "You're my son, David. But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine, not anymore. We can't go on like this." David's eyes met hers. And for the first time in what felt like years, Clara saw something real in his expression. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was the raw, open truth. "I know, Mom," he whispered. And in that moment, Clara realized this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about both of them, facing the consequences of the life they had tried to avoid. The truth was no longer something to hide from. It was the only way forward. The silence in the living room was almost suffocating, the kind of silence that only comes after a deep, raw truth has been spoken. Clara could feel it hanging in the air between her and David, the weight of all the unspoken things that had lingered for too long. His eyes were fixed on her, but his gaze was distant, like he was somewhere else, trapped between what had been and what was now before him. Clara could feel the shift in him, the way his body tensed and his jaw clenched as he processed her words. The tension in his posture was telling, the way his fingers fidgeted with the cuff of his shirt as if he were searching for an escape. Or, perhaps, an explanation that wasn't there. "I'm not going to keep pretending, David," Clara said softly, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. "I've tried to make things work, tried to fit into a life that doesn't have a place for me anymore, but I can't do it anymore. I can't live my life on the edge of a lie." David's eyes flicked up to hers, a flicker of recognition passing through them, but he didn't speak. His lips were pressed into a thin line, as if weighing his words against hers, unsure whether to speak the truth or keep quiet. "I understand that this isn't easy," Clara continued, her voice more resolute now. "But I can't live in the shadow of your marriage, trying to be everything to both you and Emma. It's not healthy for any of us." She swallowed hard, her heart aching with the weight of the admission, but she knew it was true. "I've tried to hold on to the hope that things would get better, but all they've done is get worse." David shifted in his seat, and Clara could feel the walls he was building again. She had seen that look on him before, the one that said he was retreating, closing himself off to protect what was left of the old family. It wasn't new. It had been building for years. "I don't know what to do, Mom," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's not like I don't care. I do. But everything's so complicated now. With Emma. With you. I don't know how to fix it." Clara's eyes softened for a moment, but her resolve didn't waver. "You don't have to fix everything. That's the problem, David. You're trying to be everything to everyone, and you're burning yourself out in the process. You can't keep balancing us forever." She paused, letting her words settle into the space between them. "I've made my decision," she said quietly, but firmly. "I'm not going to keep bearing the emotional weight of this family. I'm done playing the middle. I can't do it anymore. I'm going to live for myself now. I'm going to fight for my independence. David's expression faltered. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the tug of war between the man he had become and the son she once knew. But Mom, I don't want to lose you, he whispered, his voice cracking. I never wanted this. You're still my mom. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, her chest tightening as the truth weighed heavily on her. It wasn't that she wanted to walk away from him. It wasn't that she didn't love him. But the love she had for him, for their family, had become twisted, suffocated by all the years of silence and unspoken resentment. Clara had poured everything into her son's life, believing it was the right thing to do. But now she understood. She had to stop losing herself in his shadows. She had to stop being his emotional crutch. You're not losing me, David. I'm not going anywhere, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. But I need to live my life. I've been so focused on what's been wrong, trying to fix things that aren't mine to fix. I need to let go. David didn't respond immediately. The quiet stretched on, each passing second heavier than the last. Clara could feel the tension between them, the unspoken words floating in the air. But she wasn't going to take them back. She wasn't going to apologize for this. She had to stand firm, no matter how much it hurt. Emma, still absent from the conversation, had yet to say a word. Clara could feel her absence like a shadow in the room, a silent presence that spoke volumes. She was always the quiet one in these moments, always standing at the periphery, letting David carry the weight of decisions that he could never truly make on his own. Clara's gaze flicked briefly to the empty space where Emma should have been, the silence stretching long and uncomfortable. I've done the right thing for you, David, but I've never done the right thing for myself, Clara whispered. I can't do that anymore. David shifted in his seat, but this time, his eyes held something different. Understanding? Pain? She wasn't sure, but there was something in his gaze, something that told her he knew, deep down, that she was right. I respect your decision, Mom, he said quietly. I don't know what to say. I don't know how we got here. Clara nodded slowly. She didn't know either. But the important thing was that she had reached a point of clarity, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope in her chest. I'll always love you, David, she said softly, her voice steady. But this is the only way forward, for both of us. He nodded, his lips tight as he stood up. I need to go, he said, his voice rough. I'll figure this out. As he turned and walked toward the door, Clara stood there watching him, the space between them still heavy. But this time, it wasn't suffocating. This time, it felt like the beginning of something new, something she could claim for herself. When the door clicked shut behind him, Clara exhaled, her heart still racing but lighter than it had been in years. She had made her decision. The rest, she realized, was up to her. Clara stood at the window, watching the last light of the day fade into the horizon. The evening had slipped into a quiet calm, and for the first time in weeks, she could breathe without the weight of her own emotions pressing down on her. The decision had been made, and it felt final, but somehow lighter than she had expected. She had spent the past few days wondering if she was doing the right thing, second-guessing herself in the silence that followed her confrontation with David. But now, as she stood in the quiet of her living room, she knew. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. She had made her choice for herself. For once, she was living for herself. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, snapping Clara from her reverie. Her heart gave a quick, nervous flutter. She had known this moment would come, when David would return to speak with her. She couldn't say she was ready, but she had no choice now but to face him. One last time. She opened the door slowly, and there he was, standing in the doorway, looking as uncertain as ever. His hands were stuffed deep in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes tired but searching, like he was trying to read something in her expression. Clara had seen that look before, when David was a child, trying to figure out what she needed from him. But now, as an adult, he wasn't the one who needed to be taken care of. She had given so much of herself to him, to their family, for so long. It was time for her to stand on her own. "David," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of the path they were both on. David stepped inside, but he hesitated near the doorway, his gaze drifting to the ground before looking back at her. "I've been thinking, Mom," he said slowly, his voice low, "about everything we talked about. I know I haven't always been there for you, and I know I've let things get out of hand with Emma." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, the frustration of not knowing how to fix things written across his face. Clara nodded, her arms crossed loosely in front of her. "I know, David," she said gently, giving him space to speak, but not asking for more than he was willing to give. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expression conflicted. "I don't know how we got here, how it all became so complicated, but I see it now. I see what you were trying to do. I see the burden you've been carrying." Clara smiled faintly, though it wasn't an easy smile. "I carried it because I thought it was the right thing to do. But now, I see that it's not. I see that it's been keeping me from living my own life, and that's not fair to either of us." David was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if he were seeing it for the first time. "I don't want to lose you, Mom. I don't want to see you walk away." His voice cracked at the last word, the emotion thick and raw. Clara's heart clenched, but she pushed the ache aside. "You're not losing me, David. I'll always be here. But I can't be the woman I've been. I can't carry your burdens anymore." David stood still, letting her words settle over him. Clara knew this wasn't easy for him. She knew that the weight of their relationship, the weight of his own marriage, was weighing heavily on him. But she also knew that her decision was the only way for both of them to grow. As they stood there in the quiet, the only sound between them was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara could feel her own heart steadying, the resolve inside her growing stronger with every passing second. When she spoke again, her voice was clear, unshaken. "I've made up my mind. I'm not going to live in this constant state of worry anymore. I'm moving forward, David. I have to. I can't let the past dictate what my future looks like. I have to live for me, not for anyone else." David looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, but then it softened. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if some burden had been lifted, even if just a little. "I understand," he said quietly, though there was a sadness in his voice. "I wish I could fix everything, but I see now that I can't, and I don't want to hold you back anymore." Clara exhaled, feeling the weight of his words wash over her. She could see that he had made his peace with this, even if it wasn't the way either of them had hoped. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt at peace with her own decision. Just as David turned to leave, there was a soft sound from the hallway. Emma's figure appeared in the doorway, standing just outside, looking hesitant. She didn't speak, only stood there, watching the exchange with a mixture of quiet tension and something else that Clara couldn't quite read. Emma's silence spoke volumes, and Clara could feel it. How the gap between them had widened, how their relationship had become a reflection of the tension between David and herself. But Clara knew this wasn't the time to confront Emma directly. As David stepped toward the door, he paused, looking back at her one last time. "We'll figure this out, Mom. We'll all figure it out. But you're right. We can't keep living like this." Clara nodded, watching him leave, the weight of the moment settling around her like a shroud. Emma remained standing in the doorway, silent, her gaze unreadable. Clara took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, the anticipation of what came next. Her new life had begun, and she was ready to embrace it. Clara spent the next few days in a quiet blur where the weight of her decision settled like a soft, constant hum in the back of her mind. She could hear the sound of her own thoughts less and less, the usual rush of uncertainty receding as she slowly found peace in the silence she had chosen for herself. The constant noise of trying to appease everyone, to fit into a life she no longer recognized, had been a burden she no longer needed to carry. She had spent so many years filling the empty spaces with noise, pleasing David, trying to be the good mother, the good wife. But now, as the silence grew louder, she realized how much of herself she had lost in all those years of keeping up appearances. The phone calls from David started coming after the conversation. At first, there was a tremor of uncertainty in his voice, a quiet plea for some kind of connection, a sign that he was still her son. His voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but the connection was fractured, the words no longer carrying the weight they once had. She let the phone ring, her fingers hovering over the screen each time. The text messages came next, filled with apologies, regret, and endless explanations. But Clara didn't respond. She couldn't. She had nothing more to say, and nothing to give. It wasn't anger that held her back. No, it was something else. Something far stronger. A quiet certainty that the only way forward was in the stillness, in the space she was carving out for herself. No more balancing the guilt. No more trying to hold on to a dream that had long ago unraveled. With each unanswered call, Clara felt the weight of years of accumulated silence lift from her shoulders. For the first time in ages, she felt like herself again. She felt light. Jack, her longtime friend, seemed to understand that shift before she even put it into words. He had been a quiet presence in her life for years, offering wisdom, comfort, and a steady hand when she needed it most. It had been Jack who had been there after her husband's death, when she had first felt the strain of trying to keep the pieces of her life together. Now, Jack was her confidant, her sounding board as she navigated this new chapter of her life. They had spent hours together in recent days, over coffee, walking through the nearby park, talking about everything and nothing at all. Jack was one of the few people who never asked too much from her, and for that, she was grateful. "You're doing the right thing, Clara," he told her one evening as they sat on the old park bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "You've been carrying their weight for far too long. Now it's your turn." Clara looked at him, the corners of her mouth curling into a smile. It was the first smile she had allowed herself in weeks, and it felt like a breath of fresh air. "I'm finally starting to believe that," she admitted softly, watching the last traces of daylight fade. "I've spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to be the glue that held everything together, but I'm not responsible for their lives. I can't fix what's broken in them. It's not my job anymore." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed ahead as the world softened around them. "It's hard," he said quietly, his voice rough with understanding. "But you'll see. This silence, this peace, it'll be worth it." And it was. As Clara allowed herself to settle deeper into the quiet, something unexpected began to blossom inside her. She started walking more, finding solace in the rhythmic sound of her feet on the pavement, the cool air against her skin. She joined a local book club, a group of women she barely knew, and found herself drawn into conversations about ideas, stories, and the kind of things that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. The days became easier, and with each passing one, Clara grew more comfortable in the space she had carved for herself. It wasn't lonely, it was freeing. The weight of other people's expectations, of the responsibilities she had tried to shoulder for so long, no longer weighed on her. But David and Emma weren't far from her thoughts. Every time the phone rang, her pulse quickened, and every message, especially from Emma, felt like an echo of something she had once desperately tried to hold on to. One evening, as she sat reading on the couch, her phone buzzed with another message from David. She glanced at it briefly, then placed it face down on the coffee table. There was no anger in her chest, just a quiet sense of resolve. She didn't need to hear what he had to say. She had already heard it all, and it no longer mattered. A few minutes later, another message came through. It was from Emma this time. Clara didn't even bother to look at it. The past had a way of reaching out, but Clara was done. She had chosen silence for a reason. She set the phone aside and picked up her book again, the words pulling her back into the life she was now living. The life where she no longer answered to anyone but herself. And as the night stretched on, Clara realized she had never felt more alive. The world outside might have kept spinning, but she was no longer caught in its endless orbit. She had taken control of her own destiny, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. As the light of her lamp bathed the room in soft warmth, Clara felt the final, quiet echo of her old life fade away. She was ready for whatever came next. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as the morning light streamed through the window. The world outside was waking up, the streets slowly filling with the sounds of neighbors going about their day. Birds chirped in the trees, and the soft hum of traffic in the distance filled the air. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, quiet, the way it had always been before the weight of the past had consumed her. But as Clara sat there, a thought bloomed in her mind, more clear now than it had ever been before. She could no longer live in this house, surrounded by memories that no longer served her. This place, once filled with the sounds of her family, had become a reminder of all the things that were broken. It was time to move on. The house, though comfortable, had become a cage. She had spent so many years here, trying to hold everything together, living for others, but now it felt empty, suffocating. It was time to release the past, to leave behind the version of herself that had been shaped by others' expectations. She had spent years keeping a home for David and Emma, never once thinking about whether it was a place for her. Her hands had worked to maintain their life, but now, as she sat in the quiet space that she had called home, she realized she needed to let go. There were so many things she had kept hidden, so many things she had buried deep within her. Her hopes, her dreams, her desires. But now, as the silence stretched around her like a comforting blanket, she felt a quiet surge of freedom. It wasn't just about leaving the house, it was about leaving behind the weight of other people's expectations, about carving out a space for herself that was hers and hers alone. Jack had seen the change in her before she had fully recognized it. He had always known Clara, perhaps better than anyone else, and had never judged her for her decisions. But even Jack, the wise friend who had stood by her all these years, had noticed that the time had come for her to make a clean break from the past. One evening, as they sat on the same park bench where they had shared so many conversations, Jack looked at her with his steady, knowing gaze. "Clara," he said softly, "it's time to cut ties. You've been holding on to something that's gone. I think you know that. It's time to let go completely." His words landed like stones in a still pond, ripples spreading outward, echoing in her chest. She had always feared cutting ties, afraid of losing the last thread of connection with her son and his family. But deep down, she knew Jack was right. She couldn't keep holding on to a relationship that was no longer serving her. Clara nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. "I know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's time." It wasn't just a decision to leave the house. It was a decision to prioritize her own peace, her own happiness above all else. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had been. She needed to step into the light of what could be. Alone, independent, free from the emotional manipulation that had dictated her life for far too long. But where would she go? That was the question that lingered, nagging at the edges of her newfound freedom. The house was her home, yes, but it had become a place of memories that she needed to release. She couldn't stay in this space, holding on to the past. Clara turned to her friends, a group of supportive women she had met through her recent involvement in the community. Over coffee and laughter, she asked them what they would do if they were in her shoes. They had all been through their own struggles, their own reinventions, and their answers were filled with insight and encouragement. "Do what feels right for you, Clara," one of them had said, a soft smile on her face. "The world is full of new places, new people, new opportunities. Don't let the past decide where you go." And that was it. The final nudge she needed. It was time to move on, to stop looking back. She didn't need to know exactly where she would go yet. The important thing was that she was going. Her heart felt light as she stood from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, casting a golden glow over everything. She could see the world unfolding before her, vast and open, waiting for her to step into it. And for the first time in years, Clara felt ready. Ready to embrace whatever came next. The decision was final now. She was ready to leave this house, to leave the ghosts of the past behind, and to carve out a life that was hers to shape. And in doing so, she realized something profound. She wasn't just moving out of her house, she was moving into her future. The weight of the past had lifted, and with it, Clara felt a new sense of clarity, a sense of freedom she had never known. The world was wide open, and she was ready to claim her place in it. And as she turned to the door, a soft, quiet certainty settled in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would move on, fully, and never look back. Clara walked into the cafe, the soft clink of the doorbell overhead signaling her arrival. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of quiet conversations around her. Her heart beat a little faster than usual, but the familiar rhythm of the space, the low murmur of voices, the clattering of cups, calmed her. She had made her peace. She had made her decision. This meeting, the last one with David, would be the final step in her journey. David was already sitting at a corner table when Clara spotted him. His back was to her, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller than he was. His hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced, his gaze focused downward. He was waiting for her to approach, but he didn't look up. She hesitated for a moment at the entrance, then walked over, her steps deliberate. When she reached the table, David finally lifted his eyes. His expression was tired, worn, and the moment she saw it, Clara's breath caught in her throat. He looked like a man who had carried the weight of his choices too long, a man who knew he couldn't keep running from the consequences of his actions. "Hi, Mom," David said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Clara smiled faintly, sitting down across from him. "Hey, David." She didn't feel anger anymore, only a strange, quiet calm. She had done all the work on her side, and now it was his turn to find his way. David took a deep breath and shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want to apologize, Mom, for everything, for not being there when you needed me, for letting things get out of hand between us. I've been selfish." He looked away, running a hand over his face as his voice cracked. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting you until it was too late." Clara watched him, the words heavy in the air between them. This was the conversation she had hoped for, but it didn't feel like the resolution she had once imagined. It felt necessary, but also final. She nodded, her gaze steady. "I'm happy for you, David," Clara said quietly, but with resolve. "I'm glad you found the strength to recognize that. But our paths have diverged. You've made your choices, and I've made mine." David looked like he wanted to argue, his mouth opening, then closing. "Mom." "No," Clara interrupted gently but firmly. "You don't need to explain anymore. I've heard enough. I've waited for you to see it, and now you have. But I can't keep waiting for things to change." David's eyes were glassy, the guilt that had weighed so heavily on him now threatening to spill over. I, I'm sorry. I should have been there more for you. I should have made more of an effort to understand. I didn't know how to balance it all. I didn't know how to be a good son and a good husband at the same time." Clara felt a deep sorrow for him, for all the years he had spent caught between those two worlds, but she also knew it wasn't her job to fix it. "You can't balance two lives forever, David," she said, her voice unwavering. "And neither can I. I've spent so many years trying to be everything for you, trying to be the perfect mother, but in the process, I lost myself." She paused, letting her words settle. "You can't go back and fix things, and neither can I. We both have to live with the consequences of our actions." David's face crumpled, and Clara saw the struggle in his eyes. The tears that had been threatening to break free for so long finally slipped down his cheeks. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, but the hurt in his eyes remained. Clara sat quietly, her heart heavy but steady. She had expected this moment to be more painful, to feel like the breaking of something precious, but instead, it felt like a door closing. The grief she had carried for so long was still there, but it no longer had the power to hold her back. She had already let go. "David," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "I've made my decision. I'm moving on with my life. I've given enough of myself, and now I need to live for me. You're my son, and I'll always love you, but I can't keep trying to fix what's broken between us. It's time for me to focus on what's ahead." David looked at her, his face full of an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really do, and I'm sorry for everything." Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, bittersweet. "I know you are, David. But it's too late for apologies." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Clara could feel the finality of this meeting, the closure she had sought for so long. The past had been buried, and now there was only the present, only the life she would build for herself. As David stood to leave, Clara stood too, their eyes meeting one last time. "Take care of yourself, David," she said, her voice steady. He nodded, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer. "I will, Mom. I promise." As he walked away, Clara watched him leave, her heart a mix of sadness and relief. The last thread had been severed, and she felt the weight of it fall away. It was time. The future was hers to embrace. Clara's hands ran over the smooth wood of the kitchen counter, the familiar rhythm of her movements grounding her. The soft morning light poured in through the window, casting a warm glow across the room. It was a simple scene, just the quiet hum of the house, the muted sounds of the world outside. But for the first time in ages, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. She took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment settle within her. The constant hum of tension, the weight of emotional demands that had ruled her life for so long, had finally lifted. It wasn't just the silence that brought her peace, it was the clarity that came with it. Clara felt light, lighter than she had felt in years. The decision to leave the past behind, to release herself from the expectations of others, had been the hardest choice of her life. But now, as she moved through her daily routine, coffee in hand, Breakfast on the table, the simple task of making her home feel hers again. Clara realized just how freeing it all was. There was no one else to please. No more trying to fit herself into a role she didn't belong in. She was free to be herself, without the weight of the past pressing down on her. She had spent so many years living for others, for David, for Emma, for the life that they all tried to hold together after her husband's death. But now, in this quiet, ordinary morning, Clara understood. She had been so caught up in the lives of those around her that she had forgotten about her own. The phone sat on the counter, silent for once, its presence no longer a constant reminder of what used to be. David had called again. Emma, too, had sent another message, but Clara hadn't responded, and it wasn't because she didn't care. It was because she cared too much to keep sacrificing herself for relationships that no longer served her. She didn't need to respond to those calls anymore. The silence was her answer. Her thoughts drifted to Jack. They had spent so much time together in the past few weeks, talking, laughing, walking through the park. He had always been there for her, a steady presence. He hadn't judged her, hadn't tried to push her into decisions before she was ready. It was Jack who had told her, gently but firmly, that it was time to stop waiting for things to get better on their own, that it was time for her to start living her own life. "You're on the right path, Clara," he had said one evening, the two of them sitting on a weathered bench in the park, the last rays of sunlight stretching out before them. "This peace you're feeling, it's earned. Don't let it slip away." Those words had stayed with her, echoing in her mind. Jack's confidence in her gave her the strength to keep moving forward, to trust that she was making the right decision, even if it didn't always feel easy. And now, as Clara looked out the window, she realized something else. She was no longer holding on to a future she couldn't control. The weight of other people's expectations had finally been shed, and she was starting to feel, for the first time in years, that she was living for herself. The past, with all its unresolved tension and guilt, no longer defined her. She had begun to immerse herself more in the community. She joined a local book club, one that had been recommended by a neighbor. At first, she had been hesitant, unsure if she would fit in, but now, after several weeks of meeting new faces and discussing ideas and stories, she was beginning to feel the stirrings of belonging again, not as someone's mother or wife, but as Clara, a woman with her own thoughts, her own interests, and her own future to shape. Clara had even made a few new friends, a group of women who, like her, had faced their own struggles and were now rebuilding their lives. They didn't ask her about David or Emma. They didn't try to fix anything. They simply accepted her as she was, and for that, Clara was thankful. Her respect within the community was growing too. The neighbors who had once only waved politely now stopped to chat, to share a cup of coffee, to ask how she was doing. She could feel the change in the way people saw her, no longer as the widow, the overburdened mother, but as someone who had finally stepped into her own power. The peace Clara felt in these moments was profound. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from avoiding conflict or pretending everything is fine. No, it was the peace of knowing she had made the right decision, the peace of knowing that she had taken control of her life in a way she never thought possible. She loved herself again. There was no more hiding in the shadows of other people's needs. She was becoming someone she could respect, someone she could believe in. The love she had for David and Emma hadn't gone away, but it had evolved into something healthier, something that no longer depended on them to define her. Clara smiled softly to herself as she watched the sun climb higher in the sky. She felt a sense of hope swelling within her, a belief that whatever decisions she made from this moment on would be the right ones. She was no longer afraid to take chances, to live her truth, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. She walked over to the window, placing her hands on the sill, and looked out at the world before her. The streets were busy now, the day unfolding as it always did. But Clara no longer felt like an observer. She was part of the world again, a participant in her own life. And as the light of the day grew brighter, so did her heart. The past had been hard, but now, for the first time in years, Clara was finally free. The decision had been made. The morning of the party, Clara stood in the middle of her new living room, the soft glow of the afternoon sunlight filtering through the windows, casting long golden shadows across the freshly painted walls. The air was still and quiet, but it was the kind of silence she had grown to appreciate, peaceful, not oppressive. Her fingers brushed the edges of a vase of fresh flowers on the mantel, and she smiled. It wasn't just the flowers or the new furniture or the artwork she had carefully chosen that made this space feel so distinctly hers. It was the feeling of finally being free, free from the weight of old memories, of guilt, of trying to make things fit that were never meant to. The new house wasn't large, but it was comfortable, cozy even. It was hers, no one else's. And for the first time in years, she had created a space that reflected her true self, not the person she had been trying to be for everyone else. The walls weren't just bare, they were filled with the possibility of who she was now and who she was becoming. Clara had been through so much, yet here she was, standing in the middle of her new life, ready to celebrate it. She had made the decision to leave the past behind, to move forward, and today was her declaration to the world that she was doing just that. Jack had been the first one to offer his support when she told him about the move. His face had lit up with approval when she shared her plan to celebrate the fresh start with a party. "You've earned this, Clara. You've earned your peace," he had said, giving her a warm, sincere hug. And now, with the party just hours away, Clara found herself filled with a nervous excitement she hadn't expected. As the doorbell rang, Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her friends were starting to arrive, the women from her book club, some neighbors she had grown close to, and of course, Jack. All of them gathered here, in the space Clara had created, to celebrate her journey, her transformation. When Jack walked in, his smile was wide, his eyes sparkling with pride. He was always the steady one, the voice of reason. And as he looked around at the home Clara had built, he said nothing more than, "It looks like your home." The evening unfolded beautifully, the warmth of new connections mingling with the laughter that filled the room. Clara stood at the center of it all, a glass of wine in her hand, surrounded by the people who had witnessed her growth. They celebrated her courage, her willingness to start over, to carve out her own life. For once, Clara wasn't just a part of the background, she was the heart of the celebration. She watched as her friends exchanged stories and jokes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen, not as a mother, not as a wife, but as Clara. She wasn't trying to fix anyone's problems anymore. She was just living, and it felt right. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to other topics, but Clara felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She was moving forward with purpose, knowing that the decision to prioritize her own happiness had been the best choice she could have made. This life, this moment, was hers to define. Later, when the party began to wind down and people started to leave, Clara stood at the door saying goodbye to the last few stragglers. Jack was the last to go, lingering by the door for just a moment longer. "You know, I'm proud of you, Clara," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something deeper, something like awe. "You've come a long way." "I couldn't have done it without you, Jack," Clara replied softly. "I needed someone to remind me that it was okay to let go." He smiled and nodded. "It was never easy, but I'm glad you did, and I'm proud to call you my friend." After Jack left, Clara lingered by the door for a moment longer, looking out at the empty street. The cool night air brushed against her face, and as she stood there, she realized something profound. She wasn't just moving on from her past, she was stepping into a future that was entirely her own. The weight of the years she had spent trying to please others, trying to make everyone happy, had been replaced with a lightness she hadn't known in decades. The future was no longer something to fear, it was something to embrace. Clara made a promise to herself that night, standing in the quiet of her new home. She would always fight for her respect and her freedom. She would never again allow the expectations of others to dictate her life. She would continue to live for herself, to embrace the unknown, and to step boldly into whatever came next. As she walked through the empty house, the soft sound of her footsteps echoing in the stillness, Clara felt a quiet joy filling her heart. This was just the beginning. Tomorrow was a new day, and she was ready for it. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt truly alive. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as Clara sat across from her lawyer, a man named Mr. Donovan, who had handled her legal matters for years. The office, bathed in the soft amber light of the setting sun, felt cozy, familiar in a way that calmed her nerves. It was hard to believe she was here for this, finalizing decisions that would shape the course of her future, even after she was gone. The conversation had started simple enough. Her will, the estate, the house she had carefully turned into a home. But as the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself reflecting not just on what she had built, but on what she wanted to leave behind. She had spent so much of her life worrying about everyone else, trying to fix things, to make them right. Now, for the first time in a long time, Clara realized that her legacy was going to be more than just the tangible things she could leave to her son or her community. It was going to be about something deeper, the impact she had on the people she loved, the values she stood for, and the love she gave freely, without expectation. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the table as Mr. Donovan reviewed the papers in front of him. She had decided, no, she had chosen, that her house, the place where she had spent years trying to hold on to memories of a life that had passed her by, would be donated to community programs. She had spoken to a few local charities over the last few weeks, and the idea of giving the house to a cause that would help others felt right. The thought of it no longer being tied to the ghosts of her past gave her a deep sense of relief. "I've decided," Clara began, her voice steady as she addressed Mr. Donovan, "that everything I have, my house, my assets, should go to programs that help people, especially women who need a second chance." Her words were careful, deliberate. She had thought this through. "I want to set up scholarships for women who need the opportunity to rebuild their lives, to start over like I did." Mr. Donovan nodded, his face giving away little, but Clara could see the quiet approval in his eyes. "I'll make sure everything is done according to your wishes," he said. "You've given it a lot of thought, Clara. This is a meaningful legacy." Clara smiled faintly, her gaze drifting out the window. The golden light of the sun had turned to a soft purple, and for a moment, the weight of her decision felt both final and freeing. The money from the sale of the house and her other assets would go toward the scholarships, ensuring that women who had been through difficult circumstances had the chance to create new futures for themselves, just as she had. She had never been a wealthy woman, but she had worked hard, built a life. And now, she was finally understanding what her true wealth had always been. It was never about the material things. It was the lessons she had learned, the strength she had gained, the relationships she had formed, and the compassion she could give. As the paperwork was finalized, Clara signed the last document with a steady hand. When she was finished, she placed the pen down slowly and looked up at Mr. Donovan. "This is it," she said quietly, almost to herself. "This is the last of it. My past is behind me." The lawyer gave a small nod. "You've done well, Clara. You've made sure that your legacy is built on your values and not just what you've accumulated. Clara stood up, the soft creak of the chair beneath her breaking the silence. I've learned that what matters most isn't the stuff we leave behind. It's the lives we touch, the love we give, and the peace we find within ourselves. That's the legacy I want to leave. As she walked out of the office, the cool evening air hit her like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that her life was now truly her own. She had taken the steps to ensure that her future, and the future of the women who would benefit from her scholarship fund, was something full of hope and possibility. She was no longer the woman defined by others' expectations. She was Clara, just Clara. Later that evening, when she met with her friends, the women from her book club, they listened intently as Clara shared her decision. They didn't interrupt or ask questions. They simply sat with her in the quiet understanding of what it meant to make such a profound choice. One of them, a woman named Eliza who had been through a particularly difficult divorce, placed her hand gently on Clara's. "You're setting an example for all of us," Eliza said softly. "You've found peace, and now you're giving that peace to others. It's more than any of us could have imagined for ourselves." Clara nodded, feeling a surge of warmth. She realized in that moment that her decision to give was not just an act of generosity, it was an act of love. She was leaving behind not just material wealth, but the kind of legacy that would continue to change lives long after she was gone. That night, as Clara walked back into her new home, she felt the last remnants of her old life fall away. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And in that, she found something even more precious than anything she could leave behind: freedom. Clara closed the door behind her, the familiar scent of her home surrounding her like a comforting embrace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she allowed herself to rest in the peace she had created. The weight of the past was gone, and in its place was the lightness of a future that was hers to shape. As she sat down in her favorite chair, she reflected on everything she had accomplished. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had given, and that was more than enough. The future was wide open, and she was ready to step boldly into it. The cafe was quiet, the hum of soft conversation and the clink of coffee cups providing a gentle background to the moment. Clara sat at a small table near the window, the early afternoon light spilling in, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floor. Her hands rested on the table, fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic cup in front of her. It was a peaceful place, a space she had come to appreciate for its simplicity. But today, the calm felt different. It felt heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. David arrived a few moments later, his footsteps hesitant, his eyes searching the room before landing on her. He smiled faintly, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, those eyes that held the remnants of guilt, of uncertainty. He took a seat across from her, his movements slow, almost reluctant, like he was unsure whether to take this step. Clara studied him for a moment. He was still her son, but the distance between them felt more pronounced now. The years of tension, the silence, the weight of his choices, they hung between them like a wall she couldn't ignore. And yet, as she looked at him, she could feel the undercurrent of love that had always been there. It was just different now. "Mom," David began, his voice low, almost apologetic. I want to apologize for everything, for not being there when you needed me, for not understanding what you were going through. I can't keep blaming Emma for everything. I've had my part in this mess. I've been selfish." Clara's breath caught in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had been waiting for this moment, yet hearing him say it aloud felt different than she expected. She had hoped for this apology, but now that it was here, she found herself unsure of what to say. "You don't have to apologize, David," Clara said quietly. Her voice was steady, though the words carried a weight that surprised even her. You've made your choices. You've lived your life the way you've needed to, and now you're here, taking responsibility for it, and that's all I could ask for. David's face softened, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm always failing, always torn between you and Emma, between the family I have and the family I used to have. I don't know how to fix it. Clara took a slow sip from her cup, her mind drifting back to the years she had spent trying to hold everything together. She had been torn too, torn between being a mother to him and a wife to his father, between keeping peace and finding her own voice. And now, she realized, that tug of war was no longer hers to carry. David, she said gently, her eyes meeting his, I can't help you fix this anymore, and I don't want to, because I've spent my life trying to fix things that aren't mine to fix. What I've learned is that I need to live my life for me now. I've spent so long trying to please everyone else, trying to hold on to things that were never meant to stay. It's your turn now to live your life, however that looks for you. David looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The air between them seemed to grow thicker as he wrestled with her words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma, she doesn't get it. She doesn't understand why I'm always so conflicted. She wants me to be everything to her, and I can't keep up with it. But I don't know how to let go. I don't know how to stop trying to be the son she needs and the husband she wants me to be. Clara's heart ached for him. But she also knew there was nothing more she could give. You can't balance it forever, David. And you shouldn't have to. The pressure you're feeling, it's not your responsibility to fix it all. You need to find your own path, separate from Emma's expectations, from my own. And you need to let me go too. David's eyes lifted, searching hers. But I don't want to lose you, Mom. I don't want us to be like this. I thought we'd get back to where we were. Clara let out a breath, her chest heavy with the weight of her own decision. We're not going back, David. What we had, what we thought we had, it's not real anymore. And that's okay. I'm happy for you. I want you to find peace. But I've found mine too. And that peace doesn't include me holding on to a home that no longer feels like mine. David sat back in his chair, the quiet between them stretching on. Clara could see him grappling with everything she had said, and part of her wanted to soften the blow, to reach across the table and offer him comfort. But she knew better now. She had learned that true love was in letting go, in giving someone the freedom to make their own mistakes, their own choices. I'm not asking you to understand right now, Clara continued, her voice low but resolute. But I need you to know that your old home doesn't exist anymore. It's gone, and I don't want it back in any form. It's time for both of us to move forward, separately. And I'm doing that, David. I'm walking my own path now. David's lips trembled, a flicker of pain crossing his face. But he didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. Instead, he nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, like he understood the weight of her decision. I guess we're both figuring out who we are now, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I just wish it didn't have to be this way. Clara placed her hand on the table, offering him a quiet reassurance. It's not the way we wanted, but it's the way it has to be. We both deserve the chance to live our lives on our own terms now, and I'm doing that. I hope you can too. David stood, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes no longer filled with the confusion and guilt that had plagued him before. Clara stood as well, her legs feeling steadier than they had in years. I'm proud of you, Mom, he said softly. I'll figure it out. I just hope one day you'll understand that I never meant for it to come to this. Clara smiled gently, her heart softening despite the finality of their words. I already understand, David. You'll be okay. We both will. As he walked away, Clara watched him go, feeling the bittersweet tug of a relationship she had once clung to but could no longer sustain. She was ready for the future, but she would always love him. And as the door closed behind her son, Clara stood alone, stronger than ever, knowing she had made the right choice for herself. And as the silence settled over the cafe, Clara realized this was truly the last conversation they needed to have. Clara stood in front of her new home, the sun casting a soft golden hue over the quiet street. It had been a few weeks since she had officially moved in, and every day felt like an unfolding chapter in a story she had only just begun to write. The house was hers, but it was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a canvas, a space where she could create something entirely her own, something she had never truly had before. Inside, the house had become a reflection of her journey. She had taken her time arranging the rooms, selecting pieces of furniture that felt right, not for anyone else, but for her. Each detail felt deliberate, each corner imbued with a sense of ownership, a sense of self. There was a comfort in the way the light filtered through the windows, casting patterns on the hardwood floors, and in the way the air felt fresh, untouched by the past. Clara had decided to let go of the baggage that had weighed her down for so long. She had spent years carrying the expectations of others, worrying about things beyond her control, but now, in this quiet space, she understood something profound. Peace was a choice. It was a slow process, one that unfolded in small daily acts. In the morning, she would take walks around the neighborhood, greeting neighbors with a smile and a nod. It was a simple ritual, but it grounded her. It made her feel connected, like she was finally part of something bigger than herself. There was joy in the quiet, in the little moments that came with living at her own pace, and with each step, she felt herself shedding the layers of doubt and fear that had once defined her. The community, too, had embraced her. The women from her book club often invited her out for coffee or lunch, and they had become more than just acquaintances. They were a circle of friends, women who understood her in ways that went beyond words. They had all faced their own struggles, their own moments of reinvention, and together they formed a quiet strength that Clara had never known she needed. One afternoon, as she walked with her friend Eliza, who had been through a particularly messy divorce, Clara found herself laughing in a way she hadn't in years. They strolled down the tree-lined streets, the sound of their laughter mingling with the rustling of the leaves above. It was one of those moments when time seemed to slow, and Clara realized just how much she had changed. She no longer felt like she was waiting for permission to live. She was living, fully and completely. "I've been thinking about the way you live now, Clara," Eliza said, breaking their comfortable silence. "You've found something that a lot of us are still searching for. Peace, freedom, whatever you want to call it. But you've found it." Clara glanced at her heart warming at the sincerity in Eliza's words. "I think I've always had it within me," Clara replied. "I just needed to stop looking outside myself for it." They walked on, their conversation ebbing and flowing like the gentle breeze around them. Clara had come to understand that happiness wasn't something you stumbled upon. It was something you built, piece by piece. It was found in the small victories, in the act of showing up for yourself, day after day. Back at home, Clara had established a routine that felt nourishing. She cooked meals that brought her comfort, spent afternoons with books and art, and allowed herself time to simply be. She had rediscovered the joy of solitude, of quiet moments where the only company she had was her own thoughts. There were days when she felt a deep gratitude for the space she had created, for the life she was now cultivating. She also found herself taking on more in the community. It wasn't about obligations or filling some hole in her life. It was about connection. She volunteered at a local shelter, helping women who were starting over just as she had. It felt like a full circle moment, a way to give back to the place that had given her so much. In those moments, surrounded by other women who were finding their own paths, Clara felt something shift deep within her. She had always thought of herself as a caretaker, someone who needed to be needed. But in the giving, she found that she was healing too. Her compassion, her ability to listen, and her understanding became her strength. She wasn't just giving. She was becoming the person she had always hoped to be, the woman who could move through the world with grace, with purpose, and with peace. One evening, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the fading light casting a soft glow on the world around her, Clara felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The stars had begun to appear, one by one, as the sky deepened into twilight. Her mind wandered to the future. It wasn't a place of fear or uncertainty anymore. It was a blank canvas, a place for her to continue this journey of rediscovery. "I'm doing it," she whispered to herself, the words slipping out into the quiet air. "I'm really doing it." In that moment, Clara realized that her life had shifted in a way she had never imagined possible. She was no longer tethered to the past, no longer weighed down by regrets or unspoken expectations. She had learned that her life wasn't a series of apologies or what-ifs. It was a series of choices, and with each one, she had created a future that was hers and hers alone. And as the night deepened, Clara leaned back in her chair, feeling the warmth of her home, the peace of her soul, and the promise of all the possibilities still ahead. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Clara was no longer afraid of what came next. She was ready. And in that readiness, she found something more precious than anything she had ever known: freedom. The morning air was crisp as Clara stepped out onto her porch, the sun still low in the sky, casting long, gentle shadows across the lawn. The world around her felt alive, quiet, yet brimming with possibility. She had always felt the pull of purpose, like a subtle hum beneath her skin, and now, more than ever, it was undeniable. Her life had shifted so dramatically over the past few months that she could hardly recognize the woman she had once been. Now, standing here, a few steps from the house she had claimed for herself, she could feel a new chapter beginning, one with a mission that had slowly but surely revealed itself. The idea had been forming for weeks. Small thoughts here and there, fleeting moments of inspiration as she volunteered at the shelter, listened to the stories of women trying to rebuild their lives. It became clear that her journey wasn't just about her own healing. No, it was about giving others the chance to walk the same path, to find their strength and freedom, just as she had. Her purpose was unfolding right before her eyes, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Clara had always been the one to take care of others, but now she wanted to do it on a larger scale. She had seen firsthand the power of connection, the life-changing impact of offering a helping hand to someone who had lost their way. The women she met at the shelter, women who had faced unimaginable hardships, reminded her of the power of resilience, the strength it took to begin again. Her first step was clear. She needed to expand her charity work. There were so many women who needed the guidance, the resources, and the opportunities to make a fresh start. She would create a foundation that would offer educational programs, workshops, and a safe space where women could heal, learn, and grow. Clara was determined to create a place where women could find not only solace, but also empowerment, a space that would provide them with the tools to build new futures for themselves, free from the chains of their past. As she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks and scribbled ideas, Clara began to map out the logistics. She jotted down ideas for workshops that would teach financial independence, self-care practices, and leadership skills. She envisioned a community space, a safe haven where women could come together, share their stories, and build the lives they deserved. The more she wrote, the more she realized just how much her own healing had shaped this vision. It wasn't just about charity. It was about changing the narrative for women who had been told they were less, who had been silenced by their circumstances. She had conquered her own fears, the fears that had once kept her trapped in a life defined by others, and now she was ready to help others break free. There was no turning back. The fear of failure, the fear of not being enough, those were voices of the past. Clara knew she was more than enough. She was the living proof that change was possible, that transformation could be both painful and beautiful, and that a new life could be built from the ashes of the old. As the weeks passed, Clara started to make plans for the center. She met with architects, spoke with local businesses, and began gathering a team of volunteers who shared her vision. Each conversation, each step forward, filled her with an exhilarating sense of purpose. She felt more alive than she had in years. This was her calling. This was the work she was meant to do. One evening, as Clara sat in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed. It was David. She had seen less of him lately, but they kept in touch. And every time he called, she could sense a quiet pride in his voice. Their relationship had shifted. No longer the strained connection of a son trying to fulfill expectations, but something different, something more mature, more understanding. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything you're doing," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'm really proud of you. I see it now. I see the change, and I see how much it means to you." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to her son's words. It wasn't just that he was proud, it was that he understood. He understood that this was more than just a project for her. This was her legacy, her way of making a difference, of giving back the way she had been given to. "Thank you, David," Clara replied softly. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about us, all of us. I've learned so much, and now I want to share that with others. I want to create something that helps people, that empowers them to take control of their lives the way I've had to." David's response was quiet, but his words carried the weight of acceptance. "I get it now, and I'm here for you. I'll support you in any way I can." Clara smiled to herself, her heart swelling with a new sense of peace. She had come so far, and now she was ready to bring that peace to others. This was the mission she had been searching for, the purpose that would define the rest of her life. As she sat in the stillness of the evening, the soft glow of the lamp beside her, Clara thought about all that had come before, how far she had come, how much she had learned. She wasn't just moving forward, she was building something lasting, something that would ripple out beyond her own life and change the lives of others. And in that quiet moment, Clara knew that this was only the beginning. The work ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it. She was ready to help women reclaim their lives, to help them find their own peace, their own strength. Her purpose had been defined, and it was a purpose that would carry her through whatever came next. Clara stood at the threshold of her new home, the evening sky streaked with shades of pink and lavender, reflecting the colors of a world that felt as though it had just been born anew. The door was open, the laughter of friends and the faint hum of music spilling out into the yard. Tonight was her night, a celebration not of the past, but of the future, of everything she had worked for and everything she was still becoming. She had planned this evening carefully, knowing that it would mark a pivotal moment in her life. It wasn't just a party, it was a declaration. A declaration that she had done the hard work to reclaim her life, that she was no longer the woman she had been, bound by the expectations of others or the shadows of past decisions. This night was for the woman she was becoming, the woman who had chosen to live for herself, to find her own peace, and to make a difference in the lives of others. Jack was one of the first to arrive, his presence as steady as always, his smile wide and full of pride. Clara greeted him with a hug, feeling the warmth of his support in every moment they shared. He had been there for her from the beginning, a constant when everything else had felt uncertain. Tonight, as she watched him mingle with the guests, her friends from the book club, neighbors who had become like family, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. These were the people who had stood by her, who had seen her not as a widow or a mother defined by her family's expectations, but as Clara. "You did it," Jack said, stepping over to her with a glass of wine in his hand. His voice was low, but his words carried the weight of so much more than just praise. "You really did it." Clara smiled, her gaze sweeping over the room. "It's still hard to believe sometimes," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm finally living for me." Jack nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and understanding. "You've earned this, Clara. You've earned your peace." As the evening wore on, Clara moved from one conversation to another, basking in the warmth of those around her. Her heart swelled with a quiet joy, one that had been years in the making. She felt seen, not just as a friend, a mother, or a wife, but as the woman she had long forgotten, Clara, in all her complexity and strength. The people in her life now understood her journey, and they celebrated it with her. They weren't trying to fix her anymore. They simply embraced her fully, exactly as she was. David had called earlier in the day to wish her well, his voice tinged with sincerity. It wasn't the lengthy conversations they used to have, where silence and unspoken words filled the gaps. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the distance between them, but also a mutual respect for what they had both been through. His own journey, though still unfolding, was his to navigate. And Clara, finally free of the emotional weight she had carried for so long, had made peace with it. David's role in her life had changed, and though it left an emptiness she hadn't anticipated, she understood now that it was necessary for both of them. His attempts to find balance between Emma and his own life were still ongoing, but Clara could no longer be his anchor. He had to find his own way, just as she had. The shift between them had happened gradually, but tonight, she could feel the truth of it. David was no longer a child in need of saving. He was a man, struggling with his own burdens, and Clara had no choice but to step aside and let him find his own path. As Clara stood outside for a moment of quiet reflection, her eyes lifted to the stars above. The air was cool, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt full, full of promise, full of the weightlessness that comes when you let go of everything that held you back. She was finally living her life, her own life, free from the ghosts of the past. And yet, the life she was living was richer for the lessons she had learned, the mistakes she had made, and the people who had walked alongside her. Her thoughts turned to the plans she had for the future. The Center for Women she had started to envision was coming together piece by piece. Soon she would have a place where women like her, women who had lost their way, could come, heal, and build new futures. She had always been a caretaker, but now she would be a guide. This was her purpose, her mission, and it filled her with a joy she had never known. When Clara finally re-entered the party, she found herself at the center of the room, surrounded by laughter and music, her heart full of hope. She had made the decision to walk this path, to embrace the unknown and turn it into something beautiful. And as the night went on, she danced, letting go of the weight of years spent waiting, of years spent wondering if she was ever enough. As the celebration wound down and the last of the guests began to say their goodbyes, Clara stood by the door, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had made it through. She had reached a point where the past no longer had the power to define her. As Clara stood surrounded by friends, her heart filled with hope. She realized that her life was now hers to shape, and she was ready to make it everything she had always dreamed of.